My name is oh, okay, recording is on. My name is Mai Nguyen. I am the new Associate Director of Policy Research and Tribal Governance at IFAI. I joined just about a month ago. I recognize some of the folks in the room here from when I was previously at Intertribal Ag Council. I will hand it over to my colleague Joseph to introduce himself as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mai. Hi, everybody. My name is Joseph Damaso. I am the policy liaison at IFAI. I've been with the organization for about 5 years now, so I'm really happy to see you all here today. And we'll get started. So this is the agenda for our webinar today. We will start off with briefly giving an overview of what the Farm Bill is. It feels like it's been forever since the 2018 Farm Bill, so a reminder slide isn't a bad idea. Then we'll do a chronological account of how we got to 2026 without a Farm Bill, when the 2018 Farm Bill expired in 2023. And this discussion will also provide some content about the One Big Beautiful Bill, OHR1, which includes some Farm Bill provisions like nutrition and the risk management. Then we'll look at the 2026 House version of the Farm Bill that passed out of committee earlier this month, and we'll look at the titles with provisions relevant to Indian country out of this particular version. Then we'll close out by looking at what's next, followed by a Q&A for those of you that may have questions. Next slide, please. And so I'll pass the floor on to Mai to talk about the first two.
Thanks so much, Joseph. So starting out, what is the Farm Bill? The Farm Bill is this massive multi-year omnibus law that reauthorizes, modifies, and makes new programs under the USDA. By tradition, the Farm Bill is organized across 12 different titles, which really cover everything ag and food related, from nutrition to research to horticulture and even energy. As Joseph alluded to, the new Farm Bill is very, very overdue. The last time that Congress passed a Farm Bill was in 2018. That was really, I think, a landmark moment for agriculture in Indian country. That Farm Bill included a number of provisions directly related to tribes and tribal producers, including new pilot programs to expand 638 authority to Farm Bill programs such as forestry and the Food Distribution Indian Reservation Program, FDIPR. Typically, Farm Bills are authorized for 5 years. That is to ensure that Congress goes back and looks at programs, makes changes and updates as needed. But that means that the 2018 Farm Bill actually expired back in September 2023. At that time, Congress was unable to pass a new Farm Bill, so they instead, towards the end of that year, passed a one-year extension to the following September of 2024. In 2024, we finally did start seeing some Farm Bill action about a year later than we had originally expected. At the time, the House of Representatives was led by Republicans, and the House Agriculture Committee introduced a very Republican-led Farm Bill draft. The Senate at the time was led by the Democrats, and they also introduced a competing proposal. Both of these proposals included a number of tribal-specific provisions and other provisions that would have impacted Indian country. The House Farm Bill included 46 provisions, while the Senate Farm Bill included over 77. A lot of these provisions were things that IFAI and the Native Farm Bill Coalition had advocated for. Things like increasing parity at USDA programs, making tribes eligible for programs that states and local governments are eligible to participate in, making 638 pilot programs permanent, and other provisions along those lines. However, as you know, the 2024 Farm Bill proposals did not advance. And there were a number of reasons for it, but really it came down to significant partisan disagreement on how much the Farm Bill would cost. There are some differences and nuances here, but generally, Democrats were pushing for increasing SNAP funding and changing the way that nutrition program calculated the benefits, as well as for including climate-related funding that was passed by the Biden administration in the Inflation Reduction Act. Though both of those changes would have significantly increased the cost of the Farm Bill and were generally opposed by a number of Republicans. There were also many, many other competing legislative priorities at the time, as well as, to be frank, the 2024 election results changing things. During that election, Republicans took control of the White House and the Senate. With control of both chambers of Congress and the White House, a lot of Republicans likely thought that they could get a better deal, more aligned with their priorities if they waited another year. So as a result, at the end of the 118th Congress in December 2024, Congress passed the second one-year extension, extending extending the 2018 Farm Bill authorities until September 2025. The 118th Congress ends, and the 119th Congress begins in January 2025, again now with Republican control of the White House, Senate, and the House. With control of both chambers of Congress and the White House, this allowed Republicans to advance their priorities using a legislative procedure called reconciliation. I won't go into really what reconciliation is, but it allowed them to pass this massive mega bill called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA, along party lines. OBBA did a lot of things. It made changes to tax laws, but among the many things that it did, it included numerous provisions that were typically covered in the Farm Bill. We're going to cover that really, really briefly just to give you a sense of what OBBA contained and what the impact here would be for a future Farm Bill. So among the provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill, some of the most significant for Indian countries had to do with nutrition. Through the nutrition provisions in OBBA, Republicans were able to advance a essentially cost-sharing measure, which limited future updates to the Thrifty Food Plan, which determines the amount of the SNAP benefit. The Thrifty Food Plan hasn't been updated in many years, and there were a lot of efforts to update it to increase the SNAP benefits to better reflect the actual cost of food today. The provision also, One Big Beautiful Bill Act also established new cost sharing requirements for states to administer and pay for SNAP, and it eliminated SNAP Ed, which is an educational and nutrition program that several tribes had used to provide education and outreach to their members. One bright spot here for tribes is the OBBA exempted members of tribes from SNAP work requirements. Right now, if you are an adult, able-bodied adult without dependents, you can only be on SNAP for 3 months. Without 3 months before you are subject to certain work requirements, where you have to be working in school or in training. This law fully exempts tribes from the SNAP work requirements, regardless of age and dependent status. And that's something that the Native Farm Bill Coalition pushed for with Senate leadership. OBBA also reauthorized and made changes to a range of very popular conservation programs, including CSP, EQIP, RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and ASAP. It updated and extended risk management tools, including ARC and PLC, and it increased crop insurance premium support. It also made some changes to disaster assistance and by updating and extending disaster assistance programs. And I've listed a few here that we know tribal producers tend to make more use of, including the Livestock Indemnity Program, Livestock Forage Program, and ELAP. There are many other things in OBBA that may impact Indian country agriculture. If you're interested, I would refer you to IFAI's analysis, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which goes through it section by section. We've included a link in the slides, and Aaron has also thrown it into the chat. So that's a good resource. So what does the One Big Beautiful Bill Act actually mean for the Farm Bill? And I think this is actually something that was pretty consequential. Um, the Farm Bill has historically been a very, very bipartisan piece of legislation. Typically, we have seen what's been called the Farm Bill Coalition, where nutrition advocates who want to see funding for nutrition programs go up, conservation and farm safety net folks who want to see that system be strengthened as well, come together in some middle ground to support both nutrition programs and farm safety net programs. By passing a number of those nutrition priorities in OBBA, we are breaking that Farm Bill coalition. One result of that is that Dems almost universally oppose the changes to the SNAP program, including those increased cost share, the increased work requirements for non-natives, and limits to future updates. And because OBBA was passed on a partisan basis, that makes Democrats a lot less willing to work with Republicans on passing the Farm Bill within this kind of more traditional bipartisan coalition. It also means that the Farm Bill has a lot less territory to cover because so much of the things that are typically covered in it were covered in OBBA. What really remains in this, quote, skinny Farm Bill are the things that couldn't be covered in reconciliation because of the stricter rules with passing that kind of legislation. So it's within that larger context that we then saw that the remaining Farm Bill programs yet again expired in September 2025, and Congress had to pass its third one-year extension of the Farm Bill covering all of those non-OBBA programs back in December. Many of you will remember that we were in the longest ever government shutdown last fall. The legislation that reopened the government included some of these provisions. So that finally brings us to this year. And 3 years late, the House Agriculture Committee has introduced their skinny Farm Bill proposal, the Farm Food and National Security Act of 2026. So we are going to head next into what actually was in this Farm Bill. I'm going to hand it over back to Joseph.
Sure. Thanks, Mai. So looking at the 2026 House Farm Bill, the House Farm Bill, also called the Farm, Food, and National Security Act of 2026, or HR 7567, was introduced on February 13th, 2026. In it, there are about 40 provisions that specifically reference tribes or related keywords. And in this specific slide here, under Title I, we identified 2 provisions that may have impacts on tribal communities. The first is under Specialty Crops Disaster Assistance Program, where the bill establishes a new disaster assistance framework for specialty crops rather than a disaster assistance done on an ad hoc basis through programs like ELAP. This new framework might provide more predictability for farmers, so that's a good thing. The second provision is about loan processing during a government shutdown. We've all heard and seen the impacts of the government shutdowns in the past few years. This provision requires the Secretary to continue processing market access loans and sugar processing loans during a government shutdown. So this would ensure that Native producers would continue receiving payments during a future shutdown. Next slide, please.
Oh, and thanks, Joseph. I'll just also mention that this section-by-section analysis is on our website. Aaron has posted the link in our meeting chat. We won't be going through every single provision that's included in this analysis. We're just kind of doing a highlights analysis, but if you have questions or thoughts about other areas, I definitely recommend taking a look at that.
Great, thank you for that, Maya. It's true. In this slide, under Title II, Conservation, title. There are about 10 or 11 provisions that have tribal impacts. We provided a handful of them here for you. Um, the first one is that the bill establishes a new soil health program to support tribes and states. In this provision, tribes receive an enhanced federal cost share of 75% compared to 50% for states, and with up to about $5 million per project. Under conservation practice standards, another provision allows tribes to become certifiers for technical service providers or TSPs. This could lead to an increase in service providers with experience working in Indian country. So always a bonus that way. In this title, there's also a provision that sets new deadlines for approving regional conservation partnership programs agreements. The new deadlines are 180 days for USDA to review RCPP applications and 30 days to issue payments to partners. There's also a provision that states a new minimum cost share of 50% for alternative funding agreements. Previously, AFAs didn't have a minimum cost share for partners, so there is a reduced funding flexibility here that could make it a bit more difficult for tribes to enter AFAs. Lastly, there's a provision that advances payments for fencing under the Emergency Conservation Program. The provision allows for producers to receive up to 75% advance payments for the fence repair and rehabilitation under ECP, or the Emergency Conservation Program. Next slide, please. Now I'll pass the mic over to Mai to talk about the nutrition provisions. Mai.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joseph. So there's a lot in nutrition. First off, the nutrition title is going to allow states to contract out SNAP certification to determine the eligibility of beneficiaries. This, in principle, could allow states to contract with third parties that have more experience in Indian country or are closer to Indian country to do that certification and make it easier for tribal members to enroll. It also establishes a pilot program for home delivery of CSFP food boxes, which we think could potentially be very beneficial for tribal elders who don't have access to transportation. It also establishes, for the first time, a pilot 638 program for tribes to take over procurement for the CSSP program. It is somewhat limited. Only tribes that are currently administering CSFP, which I believe there are only maybe 7 or 8, maybe 9 are doing it, are eligible to participate, and it is subject to appropriations. This title also requires USDA to designate an existing office to oversee self-determination contracts and provides $1.2 million in the authorization of appropriations for staffing that office. This isn't a standalone office of self-determination like some tribal leaders have advocated for, but it does designate a kind of point office for overseeing these contracts. I was also pleased to see that it is actually authorizing some appropriations, which, if appropriated, could provide specific funding for overseeing and running these agreements. One of the provisions that, that we are most pleased to see is what I've been referring to as LFPA 2.0. As many of you know, the Local Food Purchasing Agreement Program that was established under the Biden administration provided funding to tribes and states to purchase food locally and then distribute them to their communities through nutrition programs. LFPA was terminated last summer. Despite its popularity and its successes. I believe over 90 tribes had participated at one point in LFPA, and there's been an outpouring of bipartisan support for reviving this program. The Farm Bill partially does that. They included a program called the Local Farmers Feeding Our Communities program, which was a program introduced with some pretty significant bipartisan support. The program is very similar to the original LFPA. It would provide non-competitive funding for states and tribes to purchase locally produced foods for distribution through their hunger programs like food banks. 10% of the funds are specifically set aside for tribes. And then the only other limitation is that of the funds of funds that the tribe or state receives, 25% must be purchased from small, mid-sized, veteran, or beginner farmers within, I think, 400 miles. It also authorizes up to $200 million in appropriations. As I said, it is very similar to the LFPA program in that it's supporting purchasing food for locally for local distribution, but there are a couple key differences. First, the original LFPA had a specific emphasis on purchasing food from underserved farmers and ranchers. The majority of food had to be purchased from these types of producers. Um, and the second major change is that this local farmers feeding our communities program has significantly less funding. The way the program was originally envisioned was a combination of appropriations and mandatory funding. The big difference there is that mandatory funding kind of goes out the door without Congress needing to take any action. Under this farm bill, the local farmers feeding our communities program is subject to the annual appropriations process. Appropriators could choose to appropriate or to provide much less than that $200 million in funding, which then distributed across all 50 states and all 575 tribes would result in significantly less funding for each individual state or tribe. It also means that the funding will be subject to potential delays in the appropriations process. Just like we had a government shutdown fall, that could have impacted SNAP benefits. One thing that we were surprised not to see in the nutrition title was a lack of continuation for the 638 pilot for FDIPR. As I had mentioned earlier, under the 2018 Farm Bill, USDA was directed to enter self-determination, 638 agreements with tribes to allow them to procure foods under the FDIPR program. Over the course of that pilot program, 16 tribes and tribal coalitions have participated in two separate kind of waves. The 2024 Farm Bill that we referenced earlier made that demonstration program permanent, but the 2026 bill does not. We think this is very likely due to concerns with the cost. As some of you may recall from the 2024 cycle, the Congressional Budget Office, which is tasked with estimating the cost of changes in law, estimated that 638 for FDIPR would increase costs by 70% over the next 10 years. IFAI and the Native Farm Bill Coalition at the time had raised some concerns or questions about how they arrived at this number, given that we know that not every single tribe will participate in 638, and every tribe that does participate in 638 will probably only procure some subset of foods, not all of them. So until this score can be resolved, it makes 638 for FDIPR that much more difficult to include because it costs money in the way that the bill is scored. So that is something, however, that the main congressional leader on the issue, Congresswoman Sharice Davids, is publicly committed to continuing to push for. And I'm going to pass it back to Joseph to talk about credit.
Thank you, Mai. So we're on Title V, or the credit title. In this particular slide, you have identified recommendations made by our USDA's Tribal Advisory Committee. Side note, the TAC nomination process is still open. You'll find information on that on our policy briefs that we send out and on our website as well. So if you know anybody who might be a good representative, let them know that. The first one reduces experience requirements for farm ownership loans and 3 years, from 3 years to 2 years. This particularly is helpful for new farmers, right? Another provision in Title V allows FSA to refinance distressed farm ownership loan guarantees for distressed borrowers. This could help distressed borrowers with obtaining more favorable loan terms. And lastly, there's a provision that increases the microloan limit from $50,000 to $100,000. Next slide, please. And this title, under the Title 6 of Rural Development, there are several, I think maybe around 20, if I'm not mistaken, provisions that we've identified a few, and we've identified a few here for you. A couple of changes makes tribes eligible for the Rural Energy Savings Program, or RESP, and the Solid Waste Management Grant Program. RESP assists homeowners and rural communities with projects to improve energy efficiency, and the SWGMP provides funding for technical assistance or training to improve planning and operation of solid waste sites. Another provision creates competitive grant program for establishing meat processing facilities in rural areas. This would include being able to establish new mobile and innovative meat processing facilities and purchasing cold storage and other equipment. The third provision on this slide establishes zero and low interest loans for distressed water systems. This increased flexibility and availability of capital may assist tribes and Alaska Native villages with maintaining or improving water and wastewater facilities. The fourth provision increases the Rural Micro Entrepreneur Assistance Program microloan from $50,000 to $75,000. This same provision also increases the maximum federal cost share from 7.5% to 100%. Even though this isn't specific to tribes, access to capital is a major challenge, as we all know, for Native producers and agribusinesses. Next slide, please. And I'll pass the mic on over back to Mai for this slide.
Great, thanks, Joseph. Title 7 is education, which, among other provisions, covers funding and authorizations for a variety of tribal college and university programs. Title 7 reauthorizes but does not change funding levels for the TCU Essential Communities facilities, education grants to Alaska Native serving institutions and Native Hawaiian serving institutions, and the New Beginnings for Tribal Students program. These programs are really, really important for tribal education, especially in food and ag businesses. But as we note in our section-by-section analysis, funding, the authorization appropriations for these programs have not been changed in many, many years. At the same time, we know that the cost of education, the cost of infrastructure, the cost of equipment have all gone up, and the funding that is available does not reflect those increased costs. The education title also made a couple different changes to advance parity for TCUs. It eliminated a requirement for TCUs to partner with the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, or other land-grant institutions for research grants. No other land-grant university has this kind of requirement. It also eliminates the per-state limit of $500,000 for the New Beginnings for Tribal Students program. This program provides funding for universities to help increase access for Native students and to improve university experiences for Native students. As we all know, the number of Native students varies significantly from state to state, but originally the program was set up so that no matter how many students there were in a state, they could only receive up to $500,000. This means that certain states like Oklahoma, in principle, could receive more money for this program, though it would come at the cost of other states. The program, this title also newly allows TCU research grants to be used for research equipment, purchasing, maintenance, development, and so on. Again, advancing parity with TCUs with other land-grant institutions. Back to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Mai. For Title 10, we've identified 3 provisions here for the horticulture title. Our first provision here makes changes to tribal and state regulations of hemp. One of the changes indicates that states and tribes can choose to implement a process for inspection of industrial-only hemp production that reduces or eliminates sampling or testing. Another provision expands the Local Agriculture Market Program, or LAMP, to allow funds to be used for regional food chain coordination and purchase of special purpose equipment. While LAMP isn't specific to tribes or tribal members, both are eligible to participate in LAMP, right? So it's important to highlight. The third provision on this slide directs USDA to report to procuring traditional report barriers to participate to procuring traditional, culturally relevant, or local and regional commodities. This is particularly impactful for nutrition programs like the Dipper. Next slide, please. Title 9, or the crop insurance title, includes a provision that expands the definition of veteran farmer or rancher to include veterans with up to 10 years of farm experience, which is up from the previous limit of 5 years. It also increases crop insurance subsidies for veteran farmers or ranchers. It went from an additional 10% to an additional 15% for the first 5 years. Title 12, or the miscellaneous title, has a few provisions that are important to Indian country. The first one directs the Office of Tribal Relations to oversee self-determination contracts and self-governance compacts. If someone asks me about the difference between those, well, I'll have to pass it on to my lawyer colleagues there. Previously, the office's only statutory responsibilities were advising the Secretary in Indian policy and carrying out functions determined by the Secretary. Secondly, there is a provision that directs USDA to establish the Commission on Farm Transitions within 60 days to study and make recommendations on access to land, credit, and risk management on resolving heirs property issues. Tribal producers may face unique challenges in relation to these things, and so tribal advocates should probably consider close collaboration with the Commission. The third provision on this slide is about directing USDA to report on federal program assisting beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers access land. With this, USDA will be required to issue a land access report every 2 years and to include a review of the federal, state, and private programs as well. And now to talk about the last agenda, back to you, Maya.
Thank you, Joseph. So that is our big overview of the 2026 House Farm Bill. What happens now? The reality is Congress is pretty unlikely to pass a farm bill in 2026. Although this bill advanced from the House Agriculture Committee with some Democrat support, the Republicans probably don't have the votes to pass their farm bill on the floor. The majority of Democrats are expected to oppose it, but there may also be some Republicans who oppose it based on cost, or who oppose the concept of omnibus legislation in the first place. Over on the Senate side, we have heard that the Senate Agriculture Committee is expected to release their version of the Farm Bill in the coming months. But even if they're able to advance it out of committee, they similarly likely do not have the votes. The Senate, unlike the House, generally requires 60 votes to pass anything, which means that they're going to need to secure the support of 7 to 8 Senate Democrats, which is likely be very challenging given the current political climate. There are also many competing legislative priorities this year. As you know, right now we're in a partial government shutdown with the Department of Homeland Security unfunded, with downstream impacts on all of us who are flying, as well as on FEMA and emergency responses. The White House right now is very, very much focused on things like voting legislation and housing. And there are other items that are coming down the pipeline. We're also in a election year, which seems crazy. Though we're only in March, folks will already be thinking down to their ballots in the races in November. That means that there is going to be a shorter legislative schedule. And in addition to the entire month of August being recess, Congress will also recess for October to give their members time to campaign. Along those lines, many key House and Senate Ag Committee members are retiring or running for other office. That means that there will be kind of a dearth of leadership and significant changes in the Ag committees at the same time as they're trying to pass this legislation. So what can we actually expect for 2026 and looking into 2027? As we discussed this February and March, the House Agriculture Committee advanced their version of the Farm Bill. We can expect at some point in the next couple months that the Senate Agriculture Committee will introduce their version. The one fact we know for sure is that on September 30, 2026, the third Farm Bill extension expires. Again, doesn't mean that all USDA programs are expiring, just the ones that weren't included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Probably what is most likely to happen is sometime in the fall or winter, November, December-ish time, Congress will pass an end of year legislative package that will include a fourth Farm Bill extension. And that will roll us over now into the, let's see, 120th Congress, when we might yet again see a new 2027 Farm Bill proposal. Again, this may depend in part on what happens this election and if the control of the House and Senate change hands. So unfortunately, next year we may be here again giving the exact same presentation, which I'm sure we will all look forward to and have plenty of energy for. I want to end by thanking you all for joining us today. We're going to open up for questions. If you have any questions now, if you also are interested in learning more, want to raise concerns, want to have a one-on-one chat, I've also added my email to this slide. Please genuinely do not hesitate to reach out anytime. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you're thinking about, what you care about, what the tribes and producers you work with or are talking about. So thank you again, and that'll be the end of our presentation. We're gonna